about doing a PhD as long as 30 years ago, which my wife points out to me indicates that I am truly a very slow learner. But it was in fact when I was working on a benighted project for the United Nations in Cambodia in 2006 that I got serious, and I put together a proposal which the university was generous enough to accept. And it was then also that I met this girl who is on the cover, and it's important to identify her. Her name is Sri Lak. I took a photograph of her in the rubbish dump in Stung Ming Chai, which is where she lives and where she works, back in 2006. And I'll come back to that at the end of this short presentation. But I obviously need to thank the University of Sydney for giving me the opportunity as a late student to do a PhD. And I'd like it on record that David Kinley and Ben Saul, my two supervisors, provided superb assistance, as did people like Terry Carney, who's now just retired, and Patrick O'Mara down at the library treated me with nothing short of compassion in terms of educating me on how to do electronic research and so on, which was incredibly imposing, I have to admit, to begin with. I'd also like to thank Cambridge University. Finola O'Sullivan, I think, has done a splendid job with the book, and my wife for editing every word in this manuscript as closely and as well as she has, and my daughter for keeping me sane. And we used to walk to Sydney Uni together. She was finishing her bachelor's degree and I was finishing my PhD, and we had a father and daughter thing happening, walking to uni with our satchels, which was a really lovely experience going through Glebe. To share this university and to complete this journey. So let me talk briefly about the book. I have been cautioned that the wine will run out if I go more than about 10 minutes, so I will behave myself and throw in any empty bottles at me if it looks like I'm going too long. The argument in this book is one that I believe in strongly, and I hope gains traction out there in the real world. The argument in simple terms is that the notion of justice is fundamental to any sense of civic well-being. But the problem that we have with that, I guess, maternalistic phrase is that there's an extraordinary amount of injustice in our world, and more to the point, the courts, particularly in the developing world, are almost characteristically non-responsive to redressing these problems of injustice. The problems of injustice can, I suppose, be classified in many ways, but the ones that I find I confront most severely are exclusion, inefficiency, corruption and undue influence, and inequality. So in a very fundamental sense, the courts in many parts around the world don't deliver on the most foundational elements of their constitutional mandate. Given that, there's been a huge surge, a massive growth in what is loosely called judicial reform, law and justice reform. What the World Bank estimates recently as being something valued at $5.9 billion. I don't quite know how they calculate the figures because it's very difficult to calculate them. But $5.9 billion are spent in legal and judicial reform around the world. So it's a very significant business, very big business. And when I do the sums, as best I can identify 100-fold growth since I've been a practitioner. So when I've been doing this for about 18 years, and I can remember in the 90s, a big AusAid justice program was $500,000. That was something to sort of get serious about. No one really looks at a justice reform program under about 25 mil now. I personally ran a $350 million program in Pakistan, which was then the world's largest, and may still be. But the US State Department is presently tendering $1 billion legal and judicial reform program. And I think that these measures show the extraordinary growth. The problem, however, is that this investment in improving the way justice systems work has been extraordinarily under-effective. And there is what I describe in the book as a mounting chorus of disappointment at the underwhelming and often dismal results of these efforts. And it was, I guess, my sense of frustration about why I couldn't make more of a difference that in fact drove me to stop being a practitioner for a couple of years and to come in and do the PhD and to try and give it my best shot, and hopefully the book does that. Now, that involved me in doing a critique on what it is that, if we look at this unsuccessful way of reforming justice systems, what is it? And it can be really described in the following ways. Firstly, as Lee mentioned, it's exceptional that judicial reform is done to promote justice. It's usually to do other things. And as soon as I say that, I think it starts to sound bizarre and extraordinary. Courts usually aren't reformed to promote justice. They are reformed in order to promote economic growth. They're reformed to promote good governance, and they're reformed in order to strengthen the right arm of the state to be strong and basically to keep the streets safe and to keep the state stable. So we've got all of this money going into the law and justice reform that is, in fact, being spent instrumentally. It's not doing it for its own right, it's doing it to do something else, like economic reform or political reform or the promotion of safety. Now, there's nothing wrong with any of those objectives. They're actually all, in their own right, very important. It's just it's a bit bizarre that you're using one discipline and one public good in order to reach some other social goal. And therein, I argue, lies the problem, that in fact we've got a flaw in what development agencies like to call the theory of change. The theory of change is actually, to use a casual phrase, a bit wonky. There's not a clear logic to it. Now, the good thing about all of this is it's spurring a good deal of innovation. And so there are a lot of green shoots on the horizon, quite vigorous intellectual and research-driven empirical inquiry. So a lot of this is driven by thinkers like Amartya Sen, who you may or may not know, professor at Harvard and Cambridge, leading thinker from the Indian subcontinent, Nobel Prize in economics, who, oddly enough, said that justice reform shouldn't be focusing on promoting justice. It should be promoting the capability and the potential of the individual human being in his seminal work, Development as Freedom. So we got this line of thinking that we actually shouldn't be thinking about the economy or the government. We should be thinking about promoting human well-being. And this has, I argue, been a paradigm shift in what the whole development business is really all about. Cobbled to that, there's now, I think, increasing evidence of some convergence with the human rights discourse. I mean, it seems odd saying it now, but there's no relationship between justice and legal reform and human rights. They're two different fields of inquiry. You have human rights activists and you have legal and judicial reformers, and they don't talk to each other in practice or in the literatures. I just come back over the weekend, I was saying to Lee, from a project that I'm finding incredibly exciting in Nepal with the ICJ, the International Commission of Jurists, where we're seeking to bring together the human rights approach to justice reform and to bring it in, make it more systematic with public interest litigation and class action litigation. And obviously for me this is exciting because it brings into play some of the ideas that I'm putting in the book. Organisations like the World Bank are doing very exciting research at the moment. There are projects some of you may be familiar with, Justice for the Poor. It's focusing on perhaps the 75% of disputes that never find their way into the justice system in poor and developing countries. What happens to those disputes? They don't just fizzle. Certainly people opt out from the formal system, and the formal system is largely irrelevant. But they're doing, I think, some deeply interesting research in, well, how do people who are excluded from the formal system for whatever reason, how do they resolve their disputes? So I'd commend that line of inquiry. And finally, political economy analysis is, I think, extremely interesting. I'm hoping and encouraging Lee and colleagues to bring in a stream of political economy into this new master's program, because in many senses it's the serious game in town. And that is, how are decisions in the public sphere, particularly in government, how are decisions actually made? And when you do any analysis, it has to be some conflation of economic policy thinking, political policy thinking, and I would argue justice policy thinking. And what this immediately does is to confront us with the invisible ogre in the armchair, the development armchair, and that is the issue of power. The issue of power is actually why little girls like Sri Lanka are as poor and as excluded as they are. It's because those that hold power and those that usually control justice systems are very happy with that outcome. It's not a mistake, it's not an aberration. It's the way power holders actually want to seize opportunity. So the challenges that we face in legal and judicial reform are intensely pragmatic and will inquire not just the best research available, but the most inventive minds in how to grapple with these challenges. And I do hope that the book does that. In about 3 clauses, what I'm arguing for is the following. First of all, the goal of this endeavour should be to promote justice as a primary social good. That we don't promote justice to do something else. We promote justice because a just society is a society in which people can attain their well-being. They can have a decent economic standard of living. They will be able to hold their government to account, and they will be physically safe from being raped when their children go to school. So my argument is that we do justice reform because it immediately renders the social outcomes that development wants and claims, but has been remarkably out of touch in reaching. In order to put this argument and to frame justice so squarely at the front of the developmental goals, one has to define what we mean by justice, which is surprisingly difficult. At least it was the last bit of the book. What is justice and why is it important? And I had to, I guess, dumb down my own thinking and make it as clear as possible. I started with this concept of equity, and as a lawyer, that's what I mean. But the human word is fairness. So justice is, in my argument, all about fairness, which is different than equality. If you have a situation of unevenness and you promulgate a policy of equality, all you do is entrench the unevenness. Hence, the argument is not an argument for equality, it's an argument for equity, because equity corrects the original defect. And once you have corrected that, then you can go to equality. And this utopian, and I acknowledge that it may seem a utopian argument, is all about 2 simple things. First of all, promoting the access of the right holder to the rights that they have in law, and secondly, enabling them to exercise them. In my experience, in many dystopian countries around the world, there isn't a lack of law. There's a lack of those laws being enlivened. They don't exist in practice. They exist in the Constitution and on paper, but they don't live in the street. So the challenge is to promote access and enablement to legal rights. And this brings me finally to what I call the Sri Lanka test. Until this enormous juggernaut, this rule of law enterprise, can deliver visible, measurable, and immediate improvements to the quality of life of Sri Lanka and the 5 billion other people that fall into her state of relative disadvantage, chronic entrenched disadvantage in this world, then I'm afraid we have still to improve how we do it. So that's the book. I hope it interests you, and I hope that it's actually useful in addressing some of these challenges. And thank you very much for coming, and there's still some wine there.